Hello, and thank you for joining me on this podcast from Experience, the Grief Collection. I'm your host, Bianca Welsh. I'm a mum, a lost mum, a restaurateur with a behavioural science degree, and a proclivity for all things to do with trauma, grief, and mental illness. I've got a lot of personal lived experience, and this is the podcast I wish I had after experiencing my own grief and loss. In this episode, we discuss suicide, as well as other topics listeners may find distressing. If today isn't feeling right for you, perhaps come back another time. Suggested supports and other resources are in the show notes. So why would I do a grief podcast? What might I add to the vast podcast world? I'll provide you with stories that might help you feel seen, feel less alone in what you're experiencing or have experienced, perhaps an idea on how to navigate the healing journey, because there's no playbook for grief. There's no guide. We all grieve differently, thus we all heal differently. Perhaps you're helping support someone on their grief and loss journey. Maybe you're just curious about how some people overcome the worst time of their lives. The thing with grief is that this is the one given in life. It is the one thing we will all experience at some point, the loss of someone or something that we love. As the great wordsmith and musician that is Nick Cave quotes in a letter to a fellow griever, "If we love, we grieve. That's the deal. That's the pact. Grief and love are forever intertwined. Grief is the terrible reminder of the depths of our love, and, like love, grief is non-negotiable." End quote. Yet we rarely talk about it in the Western world. We're never prepared for it, but perhaps we can never be prepared for it. I wasn't, but I hope if we were more open to talking about it and aware of other people's journeys and stories, we might feel less alone in the dark depths of grief, and perhaps the healing journey might not feel as daunting. I acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the original owners of this island, Trawana Lutruwita, Tasmania. I'm on the country where the Taranata Panir, Paninaher and Lita Myarina clans of the Stony Creek Nation converged. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the deep connection to the land and waterways. I express my gratitude in being able to live, work and play on this beautiful country. Sovereignty was never ceded. I honour the rich tradition of storytelling as a vital way of passing down knowledge, culture and history through generations. Thank you and welcome. I am so honoured today to have Indira Naidoo join me here in person in Launceston. Indira Naidoo is one of Australia's most popular broadcasters and authors. During her 30-year award-winning journalistic career, she has hosted and reported for some of the country's most distinguished news and current affair programs, including ABC's Late Edition and SBS TV's World News, and the host of ABC Radio's Weekend Nightlife. Indira is currently the host of Compass on ABC TV. A passionate advocate for environmental and food sustainability issues, she is the author of the best-selling The Edible Balcony and The Edible City, has designed award-winning gardens and helps community groups build their own food gardens. She's a sought-after speaker and facilitator and is an ambassador for Sydney's homeless crisis centre, the Wayside Chapel. Indira's latest book, The Space Between the Stars, on love, loss and the magical power of nature to heal, really has made a big impact on me and was so important for my journey of healing. And The Space Between the Stars was shortlisted for the 2023 ABIA Non-Fiction Book of the Year. Hello, Indira.
Hello, Bianca. What a beautiful intro. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I want to begin by acknowledging the loss of your sister.
Thank you.
Which is the main part of your book.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that story and journey first. And it was a few years ago now. Where and how and what does grief feel like for you today?
Well, it was almost 5 years ago, which is pretty incredible. How time sometimes in the journey of grief you can feel like you're stuck in a moment, and it's as if it's happening to you right now. And then there are other times that it feels so far in the past, and you can barely remember what the feeling was like. So that's, I think, something that people don't tell you about grief. It's not this continuous line of intense and then it gets more and more subtle and distant. It sort of fluctuates, and one day can bring incredible pain and loss and sadness. And then the next moment, you've completely forgotten about it, and you're back in the joy and getting on with your life and enjoying the day you're in. And that can be quite exhausting, how it just flips all the time. And the thing I can tell you is 5 years on, it does soften, and in a way that becomes very livable with, because you do sometimes think, when will this end? When will that intensity and that pain sort of end? And it doesn't stop, but it just becomes very soft and mellow. And it's sort of like a warm, faded, I sometimes think of it as that it has that autumnal glow about it. So you see a leaf that was alive and was green and vibrant, and now it's brown and, you know, has the gold tones and it's a little bit crispy. It still has a lot of beauty to it and it still resembles what it was, but it's become something else. And I really value how I was able, very fortunately, very coincidentally, serendipitously, that after my sister took her life, I was in the middle of the trauma, the grief, and then very randomly my book publisher, who didn't know that had happened, contacted me and said, we're all going through this grief of COVID and the loss of freedom and health. Would you be interested in doing a book about how nature can help us when we're going through these griefs and losses? Now, she had no idea I was going through a massive one at the same time.
And you didn't tell her at the time?
Not at that moment. And I said, oh, I'm sure I could explore that, because that's the other thing. When you sometimes go through a grief, you're not acknowledging it to yourself sometimes. And so I was thinking, oh, well, I can just keep this as a separate road and then write a book about COVID and lockdowns. And of course, the more I talked about it, and particularly with my husband, he said, no, you're going to have to talk. This is like, of course you're going to have to combine them two. But it was only 6 weeks after my sister died. So I thought, how am I can't even find the words to articulate what I'm feeling, or even to emotionally inside me think about it. How am I going to write that and explain what this feeling is to someone else? Because I had to create a new vocabulary for myself. There were feelings I had, I didn't know what the word was for them. And so I'd sit on the page and say, this happened, this is how I'm feeling. But I had to go and find the word for it. So in a way, I was lucky that it forced me to address my grief much sooner than most people would ever try to. And I'm not recommending this for anyone, because writing a book is a grief in itself, let alone going through a grief. So I was doing both simultaneously. So it was really full on. And then hosting a late night radio show for the country who are all going through different griefs, you know, different states. So it was, I look back on it, very intense. But the journaling and writing process of the book, I think, fast-tracked my grief to a certain extent. Not that you can, but it really did help me, force me to sit there with an empty page and tell myself, what are you feeling? And if I hadn't had a book, I don't think I would have done that till probably about now, 5 years down the track, which is perfectly fine. Everyone has a different grief journey and a time frame, and you don't all have to do it the same way. But this is the way it happened to me. And when I did tell my publisher that this had happened and I was prepared to write the book, she said, really? And I said, I'm going to give it a try. But if you're prepared that I won't be able to deliver a book because the grief has just overwhelmed me, if you're happy with that, I'm happy to try. And she said, yeah. So that's how the process started. And it ended up being the most, especially for a writer, the most extraordinary thing to be able to do, to be so in the moment. So usually when you're covering a news story and something happens, and then you write a few paragraphs, you do a few interviews, it goes to air on the news that night, finished, and the next day it's another version of a story or something else. With a book, you sit in it all the time, and it never goes away, and it's always in the back of your head all the time as well. And of course, when you have a big loss in your life, it never goes away. It's just always sitting there. So it meant that I couldn't run away. I couldn't go away. And I was having grief counselling at the same time, which was so important. I can't recommend that highly enough, which really helped me sit with this in so many different ways, so I could take it out of myself, put it on the table and look at it from different angles. I could look at it as from a writer, from a journalist, from a sister had lost a sister, and then from someone who was going through therapy at the time. So it meant that it was being so examined, which means that it's so rare now, 5 years on, where some element of it surprises me that comes up in that post-traumatic stress way. And I realise how important that is now, because there's very little trauma. I've gone through the trauma. I actually have worked through it and managed it. And the only thing that will sometimes happen is there'll be a lyric in a song, and it'll be more that sadness and melancholy. But it's not that trauma that I can see. I've seen with other people who've gone through griefs and loss, where they just freeze and they just go right back to that moment where that original grief happened. I've worked through a lot of that. So I'm very, very grateful, and the book was such an important process of that.
Wow, it's incredible. One, how you were able to push that fourth wall, how almost your professional pursuits kind of were like an armour for you to be able to put into this incredible tragedy of your sister dying. And you talk so well about it. Like, I can feel how assimilated the grief is with you, like that you've just accepted it so wholeheartedly. And I think in my experience, that has been the thing that has got me to today, and to be able to talk about it so openly is because I've accepted it. And what I've learnt through a lot of talking to people and reading a lot of stories about grief is that you've got to be in it. You have to sit with the pain and the discomfort with grief. And then with trauma, as I've learnt, you've got to sit with it. You've got to almost be beside it like it's a friend and walk alongside. Whereas with grief, you've really got to front up to it. And it sounds like you were kind of forced to because of work. But in the same sense, you could have very easily said to your publisher, and I'm sure she would have understood, for you to say, no, I can't do this at this point. But you did with so much bravery, but almost like a call to action, like your body knew that you needed to do it.
And I think also I was lucky, Bianca, because the writer in me wanted to understand. And the writer from me was quite different from the sister. You know, so the sister was in the pain and the trauma, but the writer wanted to understand, what is that? What does that feel like? What are you going to do with it? What is that going to inform you about? How are you going to grow or be ossified? Some people can be. And the thing that I never understood at the time, that if I did, which I can so recommend, is that the act of writing a book, fortunately that other people connected with, meant that I heard, and I've heard, thousands of stories, and thousands of stories that to me were so much worse than anything that happened to me. And that is such an important process, because when you go through any sort of trauma, you think, this is the worst possible thing that could possibly happen. No one can understand what I'm going through, what I'm feeling, which obviously is very legitimate and justified. But that doesn't help you move through your pain when you have that feeling. You have to get to a stage of feeling this is part of the human experience. It's painful, it's horrible, and it shouldn't have happened, but that is what is. And when you hear other stories that people have shared with me, and again, especially with suicide, there's so much shame associated with it, and people don't feel they can talk about it. So to have someone that was prepared to talk about it, to write a book about it, and someone who people knew and had seen or heard on radio or television, I think gave permission to so many people to share their stories. And there were people who shared stories when they said they're in their 50s and their mother had taken her life when they were children, and they'd just told everyone, their school friends, their family, that she died of cancer. And people, this woman in particular, I remember her story, she said, now after reading a book, I'm starting to tell people what really happened. And for me, that was so powerful, that something about telling this story was going to open up that acceptance and that authenticity that, of course, we all have to have. If you live with that shame and that fear, then that trauma and pain is never really going to be fully resolved. And so some of those stories that people would say to me, I think, how did you get through to that? I mean, this was hard enough for me, but I was a grown adult when my sister died. So imagine when you were a child, if this happened. People told me stories where a father had died from cancer and the younger son was really close to him, and it was a woman who read my book who contacted me, and the son was so affected by his father's death from cancer, he took his life the next day.
Oh.
So I'm hearing stories like that where you just can't even, that sort of grief then that family had to cope with, within 2 days. And it just makes, of course, any sort of suicide has a trauma in itself. It's quite a different death to any other deaths. But you hear some of those stories and you do come away thinking, well, I feel like I was a bit luckier than that, which you would never think that you could associate suicide and luck in the same sentence. But because I was able to share my story, people were able to share theirs. And it actually lessened the load of what my story was to me. So it really helped.
I can only imagine how powerful that must be. In my very small amount of social media sharing about TFMR, and a couple of times I've done some keynotes and things, and it's the older women that really stick with me, and they come up to me and they say, I told everyone I had a stillborn, or I was never able to hold my baby, or I've never talked about it. My living children don't know that I'd lost a baby. And by you talking about this now has helped allow me feel that I can talk about it.
Yeah.
It could be a really messed up way of thinking. I think we've all got, in terms of resilience, like I read your book and go, oh my God, your resilience through that, through COVID, through the distance, all the things that you went through during that time. It's a book about resilience as well, and the way you front up to healing, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and the different modalities that you researched and used. I think we all have a different definition of what we think resilience is. And I've recently been saying that it could be really messed up, but my definition of resilience, or my thought of where resilience sits, is that you realise that someone else has had it worse than you. Like someone else has experienced worse than you, and you've just got to get on with it. And that could be a really sobering way of looking at resilience. But I know for me, when I've read other people's stories, particularly around baby loss or losing a child, losing an infant, I just cannot imagine what that would feel like. And I go, the experience we had wasn't to that. It's like an onion, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's all these different layers of grief, and we all experience it in different ways. No two griefs are the same for a range of reasons, but we all have this thread of understanding how fucked up it is.
Yeah.
But I look at families that have lost a living child as, oh my God, that is the next worst nightmare that I could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
So I've just got to kind of get on with life and live it.
Yeah. Resilience to me, I think gratitude is very deeply threaded through resilience, and gratitude is something that I've just been reading a bit about it, about the way different families explain that or show it to their children. And we would all be familiar with this. Parents sitting down, plate of food in front of you, you don't like the peas, and your parents will say, you've got to eat those peas, there's children starving in Africa. And now there's a lot of psychology around why that's a good thing that your parents said, or a bad thing, whatever. But that was something that, say, my parents would often say to us. So there's a lot of guilt about wastage of food, which is also not a good thing as well. Any sort of guilt is really not a good thing. So this concept for me was always, whatever was happening, there was something or someone that was having it so much worse. And the danger of that is it can minimise the real having it worse that you're actually having at that moment. But then most of the time, especially being back here in Launceston, and I spent a lot of my childhood growing up here, it does remind me of just what a glorious way it really was to grow up. Very protected and comforted, and so many extraordinary opportunities. And I think that I try to keep that always, like I make my mind jump immediately. As soon as anything happens that may be a flash of, oh God, why is this happening? My brain now, I have wired it to immediately go, well, you're lucky to be in this situation. You can stay here if you want, or you can leave it, or you can change, or you could talk to someone else about it. Like I've now, because that was, I guess, shown to me as a child from such an early age, I have been able to wire my brain to just immediately go to that place. So it can maybe, and I think to some of my family and friends at the time when my sister died, it seemed a bit weird because that ability immediately tried to go back in there. Well, why is this a good thing? Why is this better than what could have been? And my brain did immediately start processing a whole list of why my sister's death could have been a lot worse, which it seems preposterous in that moment that you could actually think that. But I did. And some of those things to other people wouldn't have been any comfort at all. And some of them would have actually been a bit alarming maybe. But to me, it put me in a situation where I could step out of the grief and look at it more holistically. But that sense of, I had that time with my sister.
Yes.
For all that time. That was the thing that kept on coming up all the time. Yes, this is terrible that you've lost her at this age, but look, you've had 48 years with her and you've got 48 years with all those minutes and seconds. Just go back and remember every one of those things. And there's enough memory there that can last the next lifetime of yours. And so you can make it feel like she hasn't actually gone because they were just so many intense memories. So, yeah, so I think I've had that ability to do that, which people say this about people, loved ones that they've lost, that it can intensify the connection to such an extent that you feel that they're there even more intensely close than they were when they were living. And I think I do feel that. So for me, gratitude is a key to resilience.
Yes. Yeah, I wholly and solely agree. And I love reading in your book, your chapters are intersected with like a flashback of your childhood and you speak so fondly about it and it just looks like you guys got up to so much mischief. And you've got so many amazing stories about your sister, and I'm sure that that's just a tiny snippet. And I guess we lose relationships in a range of ways, not just through death. And for you to have such fond memories and that closeness with your sister is a gratitude, because some people have siblings and they don't have that closeness or they haven't had that greater childhood. And it's really amazing that you can hone in on that and focus on it.
Yeah.
When I began reading your book and you're talking about it right at the start, I loved how you explained in the first couple of chapters the guttural howling in your head after learning your sister had died by suicide. Quote, an incessant moaning, discordant sonata only I can hear. And I distinctly remember going, I completely felt that as well. I found it so fascinating that your grief you'd experienced was so different to what I was experiencing, but the universal things that we all feel. And then I find it really fascinating to understand how each person has dealt with their grief in terms of work and how do you get back to work. I mean, what were those logistical things that happened right when you found out? You were probably scheduled to work that night. I guess radio would be very hard for you to just find someone to cover you. Like, what did those first few weeks look like, and were they somewhat semi-normal for you?
I'm a very logistics person. I go into schedules and planning anyway. Like that's my joy thing to do. And I discovered that in a crisis or where you don't have a reference point, I just went into that as well. So I found that when my brother-in-law called me and told me the news, I did the conversation and said sorry and we'll get down to Melbourne as soon as we can. And then, told all the family members that needed to be told. Just went through that pretty as if it was just a piece of information that we need to get milk from the supermarket. It felt like that. And, of course, that's shock, as you discover later on. So I was in shock for most of that evening. Went to bed, I was able to sleep, which again I look back on as pretty extraordinary. Got up the next morning, called my boss and said, we're going to have to go down to Melbourne for my sister's funeral. She died overnight. I didn't say how, I just said she died overnight. And then, of course, because it was COVID, all the planes were grounded. So there was one flight that was happening once a day and we couldn't get on that flight to Melbourne and that was it. So then we had to hire cars and all of this stuff, find hotels we could stay on the way. All the hotels had closed. There was one we found in Albury. So we drove, and it was in itself, I mean, look, all of those things, when I look back on it now, was probably a book in itself, because you're driving on streets where there's no cars and no people. You're crossing borders. The hotel in Albury we stayed, there was no personal contact, so there was no one to greet you at reception. There was just your keys left on the counter and all these notes about leaving and coming and going. We never saw another soul.
You've been thrust into this awful world of grief, but then also a physical, literal, completely weird, apocalyptic world.
So weird. And food-wise, apparently they left a message saying there was an Indian restaurant down the road that was closed, but they were serving takeaway containers of chicken korma through the window. So we just walked down the road, pre-ordered it on our phone, and they handed it through the door. I mean, God, when you look on it, very bizarre. Went back to our room and sat there and ate, and got up the next morning, got in the car and then drove to Melbourne. Because with the restrictions in Melbourne were so intense at the time, we couldn't stay with our brother-in-law and sister or any of the family in their houses. So we had to stay in a hotel in Melbourne, same sort of thing. But even more bizarre, because my other sister came from Adelaide and we all couldn't spend time in any sort of physical way. So illegally, she would come and sit in our hotel room and we had to do it surreptitiously. It was bizarre. And then the funeral, because of funeral restriction numbers, that was actually a terrible grief. So many families who had loved ones who died during that time. I really feel for them, because you could only have 20 people at a funeral. So if you were able to cross borders, and our parents were living in Queensland and South Australia and all the relatives, so some people couldn't actually get across the border in time for the funeral. And then we had to decide who could physically be there. So that was awful. And I feel for the family members who didn't get to the funeral, because as we know, it's such an important part of the grieving process. And so we were lucky in a way that we got there, and then we decided to spend more time. So we hired a house. We didn't want to stay in a hotel anymore because that was just so weird. And we hired a house and we lived in a house for about a week. And then we had different family members come in different combinations so that we didn't go over the restrictions of the numbers of people that could be in a house. It was just, again, when you think about it, very crazy. And not a very good way to manage a death or any sort of funeral environment. But we made the best of the restrictions that were around. And it was good that we spent a bit more time there, because otherwise we would have just got back in the car and driven through lockdown and the whole sort of thing. It would have just been even more surreal. So that was good in a way, that we did manage to spend some time with other family members. And then I came back and I had to do publicity for something, and I can't remember what it was. An event that I'd just done or something, a television show I'd just been in. And the publicity was for the day driving back from Melbourne back to Sydney. And I rang up my lovely agent who's been with me for 30 years and I said, I don't think I can do this. And Beverly said, unfortunately, contractually, you're obligated to. This is part of the agreement of the show. And you're the host and you have to talk about this to all the media. I said, I just can't do it. And Beverly just had a note and she just said, just think that it's just any other day. Just in your head, think it's any other day and just go into the robotic, I was thrilled to do it. Just do it like that. And she was quite strong, actually. And part of me was thinking, that's so mean, Beverly. You should be saying it's okay. I'll find a way to get you out of it. And so in that car on the way back, sitting in the car, and these journos would ring up and I'd go, yeah, it was great. I love the show. And it was so much for me, it felt like terrible pretense and so surreal. I think that may have been the hardest part when we were driving back after the funeral, that you just have to completely pretend, put on a complete act. But I did it and pulled it off, I suppose.
Did it make you angry?
Yeah, I really resented having to do that. Yeah, I really did. But I understood why I sort of had to as well, you know, that was just sometimes you have to do things where people just don't understand and they don't know, so you can't blame them, and you're not telling them, so of course it's not their fault, and you can't really tell them because it's got nothing to do with anything that you're actually doing. So yeah, the emotion around that was probably one of the hardest things I remember immediately post the funeral.
Were you almost annoyed at your notoriety, like at your position and being known and in the media?
I think there would be other people that would have had to have been in similar situations. After a funeral, if you're running any sort of business, you still have to deal with the staff and deal with deliveries, supplies, and life has to sort of go on. I think it was that very first early lesson that these things can completely shake your foundations and feel like a earthquake that you are never going to recover from. But then life just keeps demanding, well, what are you going to do about that? Is it yes or no to that paint colour? And just the things that may seem like banalities compared to what you're going through, but that is what life is. At any one time, there is something completely earth-shattering and then something banal right at the same moment, and that is what life is.
Yeah, I remember being at a cafe in Hobart waiting to, I think we had received, or we were about to receive the follow-up MRI results. So we were about to decide whether or not we would be proceeding with a TFMR or not. And we needed to eat, and it's not our home. So we just had to go out, and I was like, well, good food feeds our soul, it comforts us. So we're like, we're not just going to sit in the hotel and eat, let's just go out. And I was obviously visibly hugely pregnant. And I thought it was at that moment that I looked around just thinking, we're at a busy cafe and sitting outside, it was summer. And I thought, if we're going through what we're going through, I can only imagine statistically that all the people walking past, going about their life, I wonder how many actually, exactly as you said, have this earth-shattering situation that they're dealing with, but that we all look like we're just
having a meal,
walking down the street. And I think that's really where we as humans need to be more empathetic and remember that. And it's not until you've actually been through something like that that you really realise everyone does have a story and everyone could be dealing with a plethora of things, and we don't see it and we don't know it.
I was very lucky because of my work at the Wayside, and I work with a lot of very wise people who've seen a lot worse stuff than I will ever see in my life. They're very, very courageous, generous people. But Graham Long, the former pastor, would always say to me, Indira, be mindful that everyone you are going to see or meet at the Wayside when you do your volunteering today or your work is having the worst day of their life, probably. So if you do garden class and you spend all this time potting and sowing all these seeds, and then they go through with the trowel and they dig it all up because they have an attack of something, and you may feel really frustrated, like we just spent 2 hours planting all of those and you've dug them all up. Or you'll spend lunchtime making these delicious, beautiful sandwiches and you hand them out and someone will say, oh, that's the worst sandwich I've ever eaten. And you're so ungrateful. And then you realise, oh, yeah, they're having a really bad day. They could have just been released from jail, or they could have just heard that their partner's parole didn't come up and they're staying in jail and they don't have somewhere to live. I mean, the list is endless. And it's very good training and a reminder when you constantly say to yourself, no matter who you're meeting in your day, could be having the worst day of their life.
So it's very powerful.
Yeah, and it completely changes your interaction when you think of every interaction like that.
Amazing. I love the evolutionary theory, and I loved reading in your book about the whole concept of biophilia, and particularly around how we develop our yellow-green vision first, and that's why we're drawn to things that are green and why we're drawn to nature. It's where we knew we would find food and water, a sanctuary where we could be safe, and that green is hardwired into our DNA. Do you think that your love of gardening and your love of nature was almost another protective factor, a little tool in your back pocket that you were able to draw out almost naturally when your sister died?
I think about this, that why was it a surprise to me when I was already a gardener? I already knew the joy and benefit of gardening and how calming and relaxing I found it. That wasn't a surprise to me. And so I did used to say to myself, well, why are you so surprised? Why are you so surprised that sitting under this tree is helping you with your grief? And I think it was because it was such a big grief, because usually gardening is just when you're a bit stressed, a bit tired, you've had a long day at the office, or you just want to potter around on a day off. It just seems like a nice little thing to do. Whereas when you're recovering or you're trying to come to terms with a death or a suicide of a family member, you sort of think, really, can a tree really help with that sort of level of chaos and discomfort? And I think that was what I genuinely didn't know. I just didn't think it really was a genuine question. Well, could it really help with that? I know it can help with a bit of stress and some. So that part was quite a genuine exploration for me. And I realised that, especially with a tree, as opposed to most of the time I was dealing with little plants or seedlings or seeds, but with the tree, it was real evidence of a long life. You can't help but look at it and go, yeah, that's 175 years old. And as humans, we do think of age. Age is a really important thing to us. And how old we are, how old someone else is, how young. We're always comparing age, and we're very impressed with various ages for various things. And we celebrate, oh, that woman's the oldest woman in Australia, and they've been married, 100 and whatever years or whatever it is. And so that tree, from a human point of view, was just an impressive thing. I could see 175 years, okay. But then when I started to sit with it and really think about what 175 years may look like, and this was the real first point that just took me into this extraordinary place where nature started to give me a different timeline, realising 175 years would take it back to a certain date. So where I was sitting in Sydney on the hillside, it would have seen people arriving for the gold rushes. It would have seen people, young men and women, leaving to go to the war front. It would have seen the last pandemic that we had in 1918. And that tree would have seen all of that. And it survived all of that. And it's still here surviving. And when I started to see and understand that, it gave me such an incredible comfort, because even if I wasn't going to be around for 175 years, this tree probably was, if we looked after it. And that continuity, which is what gets broken when you lose a loved one, the timeline fractures, and you think your life ends with that person's life ending. What nature and plants and trees showed me is that continuity, which gave me a sense of hope, and that we're all only here for a little short time. Even a tree, in the scheme of things, even a star that I would look up into the sky, maybe 1 billion years, but it's still a blip. It's just a moment in time, really. And so those moments I had with my sister became more precious, and my moments became more precious as well. So I didn't want to waste any more time than I had to do the things that I didn't really want to do or had to do. And I realised that if I could spend as much time just enjoying being alive in a way that I realised I hadn't ever done before until I had to face a death. And so I thought every minute now has to be, is this exactly where you want to be and what you want to be doing? And that tree showed me that even sometimes I might feel stuck, and I'm thinking, but this tree can't ever move. You feel stuck. How do you think you'd feel if you were a tree and you couldn't literally move? And so that also, probably in quite a Zen Buddhist way, made me think that I'm not really as stuck as I've made myself feel, and I can be as free and to move, even if I never physically move. Look at this tree. And then look at everything this tree supports. Here I am again feeling cut down and cauterized in a way. And I'm just one organism, and like a tree is. But at the same time, when a tree's going through any sort of loss or grief, it's helping ants and birds and supporting all these other communities and colonies of being, and the generosity of that. And who knows what else is really going on in that tree. Its roots could be gnawing away by some pest or insect. Leaves could have been sunburnt by a hot period in the climate, but it's still trying to look after everything else and understanding the interconnection that those things are also feeding back into the tree. And so that was good too, that you're not an isolated being, because again, pain can isolate you. And as you were saying, you think you're the only one who's gone through this, but when you realise you're just part of a much bigger ecosystem of joy and grief, and if you let yourself pass the grief out, the joy will sort of come back into the same tributaries and limbs and beings. So all those things my tree taught me, that I sort of understood a little bit about nature, but not the magnitude of the saviour that nature can actually be for you in these moments.
It's really interesting and really beautiful when you start to pay attention to nature and the big wide world around us. We are such a small part of it, and you could feel really, really small, like really nothing. But you said it's about that gratitude again, and it's about making your time here count and spending your time with the things and the people that you really, really love and have time for, because we don't have that much time. All the things that you do go on to research and talk about in your book, you've got stargazing, the bird and feather expert, bird watching, foraging for edible weeds, cloud watching, gardening, jumping in puddles with your granddaughter, flying kites and watching ants. What was, out of all of those, what has stayed with you after all these years the most? And do you go back and do some of these things like often?
Yeah. It all has, actually. I think it reminds you that when you were a kid, and I love watching little kids, when you were a kid, you just automatically knew these things. Kids are just rolling around on the ground, they're picking up sticks and shells, and they're poking things and chasing after little ducks, and they see a puddle and they jump in it. And so that innate connection with nature is there in all of us. And as we grow older, the adults in our life, as I explain in the book, pull us away from nature and say, don't eat that, don't put your hand there, and don't touch that. But as children, we just want to be in nature all the time and rolling around in it. And really, that is what we should keep doing. And the adults in our life really should be saying to the children, roll around in the mud. There is so much joy in that tactile interaction with nature. So I really do believe that the answer to so much of the healing and stress that we go through is just to immerse yourself more in nature as possible and encourage everyone else to do it too. And I'm much more, even it's so funny, just even sitting here and looking at this estuary in the Tamar River and the reeds and the beautiful birds around here. I remember as a kid that I would think that this was just absolutely joyous. And my parents and adults would say, don't work in the mud and dirty your clothes and things. And even being back here, it's reminding me of those. And of course, they stay very deeply in your psyche, and then you start repeating them as parents and adults as well, which is not good. I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen with a bit of mud on your pants, really? So I am all those little bits when I do my morning walk, which I still do to my tree, the noticing of things, the paying attention is much more intensified because of this process, because of the grief and the loss, writing the book, sharing the stories of the tree. And sometimes I'll find that I get so lost in something. The other morning, there was just a ray of light that hit this beautiful cobblestone brick wall that I walked past, and it had sort of late season pink bougainvillea climbing down it. And then each one of those just looked like a jewel, the way the light came through. And I just had to stop. And I'm there power walking, and I just had to stop and stare at it. And a woman was walking really close behind me and actually walked into me because I'd stopped and I'd sort of had to apologise for it, and she was a bit grumbly and walked around me. But I just thought that it's not the exercise and the walking that was the reason for why I was walking that day. It was to have that moment, to capture that and to see that light.
It's like a form of mindfulness, isn't it?
And it was just that beauty. And then it fortifies you. And then no matter what happens in that day, you can always have that memory and that image to stay with you for the day. And there's so many of them that I think, that the intensity of attention and being present has certainly, hopefully, stayed with me as deeply as when I was writing the book, and probably more so. And also constantly reminding myself, just stop and notice, pay attention.
And do you think, is that what has been one of the more surprising things? Because it certainly has been for me, that it's been all the very little things that you almost think are too trivial. Like you said before, that it was the little things that really meant the most in your healing. All those things combined actually equal a lot. Has that been a surprising part of the journey for you, that it has been in watching some ants and flying a kite? It wasn't in this big grand gesture or any big thing that can fix this massive hole that will forever be in you from your sister's death?
I mean, again, COVID and lockdowns were a horrible thing, and terrible things happened to people during that time. But the really good thing for me was when you've got endless choice, which we have in our society these days, you can go anywhere, anytime. And suddenly you could only go, in the cities that were locked down, you could only have 5 kilometres, and that was it. That was all the space you had. And of course I was so much luckier than most. I was on the edge of the harbour and I had the beautiful botanic gardens, so it was pretty good. But when you think of it, most people in the world historically only had that much space. And historically they only hung out with their immediate family and maybe 1 or 2 other villages. So they had a limited amount of space and they had 7 or 8 people. And we look back on that limited space and limited choice. Oh, progress has been so good. We're so lucky we can go anywhere and do anything. And so I did go into it thinking this is a limitation. But what I discovered is, even though that was on my doorstep for decades before this happened, I hadn't seen any of it. I hadn't really noticed it. I didn't understand the beauty that was right there on my doorstep until I was forced to only explore it. And also the people, the concierge in our apartment building, my husband, there were 5 or 6 people, but I got to know them with an intensity and a gratitude again, very different to when I could see hundreds of people every week. So I think that we have all the joy we need right where we are all the time. And we do get distracted by thinking we have to get on a flight and fly to this Tuscan villa and we have to go and see this concert and show. And they're all great experiences. But what the time of having limited and restricted space and access did for me was remind me that it really gave me an understanding of why someone like a Nelson Mandela could be in a jail cell for 28 years and still feel that he had seen and had a joyful existence, because I didn't understand that at a time when I read his book, whereas now obviously it would be horrific, but I can understand how you could find joy in even that sort of experience. There is just the joy in being able to see, to breathe, to touch. We just don't notice, or we just take it for granted until something happens and we can't do those things. And the same thing with those little bits of nature around us, the cracks in the footpath, and you see a little weed coming out of it and you think, if you stop and notice, how is that growing there? Like, there's no soil or there's no sunlight, or people are walking over you and dogs are weeing on you, whatever. How are you surviving and where are you getting your nourishment from? And suddenly that weed, it's such a terrible word for what that beautiful plant is doing. It's a survivor. And again, all the analogies you can take from that. If that little weed can survive in that place, why am I going on about this hard time that I'm having where I've got all these other advantages? So nature is a great healer. It's a great teacher. And that restriction of space and time reminded me that I already have everything I need right where I am. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to get anything from someone else. It's already there for me.
It's definitely those silver linings and having the hope and being optimistic, definitely your superpower.
Well, nature is optimistic. When you think of it, that bird doesn't decide, oh, look, I don't feel like getting out of bed today. I'm just gonna stay in this hole. It still goes out in the water and it's looking for a bug and it's looking for a fish.
Yeah, that's so true. I've never thought about it like that. One of my most important questions for you is, what didn't work? What are some things that come to mind in those, probably in the first 12, 18 months when things are particularly raw? What didn't work for you?
I think the thing that was most challenging was that my immediate family, like my parents and my sister, I realised we were all experiencing this completely differently. And you just don't expect that that's how it's going to be. And so I might be on a certain track wanting to talk about something a certain way or express it, and one of the family members will just be completely shut down. Don't want to talk about it. No, why do you want to talk about it? That's too painful. And I found that quite difficult because my normal support network weren't able to play the roles that they would normally play. And everyone's grief is unique to them. So the same event will happen, but everyone will experience it differently. So you have to allow people to do that. And you might think, come on, face up to it. Why are you being so slow about this? Can we just get there and talk about it? But you've just got to let everyone do it the way they're going to do it. And the thing I say about grief is there isn't a timeline that you have to get from A to B and then do C and D, but you shouldn't sit in A. So it should be movement all the time, but at your pace. So it did feel quite lonely in those. Well, in a lot of ways, it's still an alone experience in a way, so that there are some things I can talk about and share with family members and friends, but then there are other things that they're not quite there or they don't see it the same way, you know. And the main area is I never went into any sort of blame area personally, not once. Now, I didn't understand that a lot of that's very natural, and so many of my friends and family immediately started blaming themselves. Why didn't they do this, or why could they have done that, or was it something I did or didn't say, or me being a mother or a parent and all of that sort of thing. I was just really lucky that I didn't go into that. I must have just understood that wasn't going to help at all. You think there's going to be someone that can play this role of, we can pull together as we've done in other things, but some of these big griefs, you should be prepared for that. You're going to have to navigate it for what's right for you. And there will be times you can do things together and support each other, and there are other times you're going to just have to do what's best for you. And I think that was the hardest part of this journey, and continues to be, because we're all so different. We were different before this happened, and of course we're going to carry on being different as well. But you have to be right to you. Because of course writing a book so close after my sister died, that wasn't something that all my family members would have ever considered doing. And we talked about it, and they said, look, if you think you can do it. They didn't think I would actually be able to get through the whole process, because it was so debilitating a grief for most of them. And I made sure that my sister and my family read it before it went to the publisher and things, and they gave me some lovely feedback. But there were a lot of family members that still to this day have not been able to read the book. And I just have to accept that when they're ready, they will, and maybe some of them never will as well, which the writer in you is also quite upset about, because, you know, when you write something, you want people to read it. But it's an understanding that these sorts of exercises are, you have to do what's right for you, and you do it with as much care and empathy and consideration for others around you, so you don't want to do anything that hurts people. But sometimes there is just going to be hurt in these situations. Whichever way, there's going to be pain and hurt. And I think overall, I really do believe, which I didn't understand at the time, I was hopeful that this book would help someone. If it just helped one person, I was going to be very happy with. But you really obviously didn't want to hear or think about anyone that would be hurt by it. But my sister's daughter is probably the person I kept in my mind throughout this whole process, and she has loved this book. She loves the tree. And so for me...
that makes me so emotional.
Yeah. And so for me, that's all...
Yeah, job done.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the healing it gave you as well. That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Actually, I've always wondered, what would you call yourself? You refer to your sisters as Star Girl and Dreamcatcher. What would you refer to yourself as?
No, I've actually been asked this, and I've never thought about it, because for me, I was just always the narrator, you know, looking at the world through my eyes and looking at all these places, people playing roles in it. So I never really thought about me as a name that I would use.
Oh, wow.
So I leave that up to the reader. You know, you can come up with a name that you think. But the funny thing is that I realised through the whole process that I was certainly, even though I made out Star Girl, my sister, to be a bit naughty, I was actually very naughty. And like some of the naughtiest things in the book I did, like there's a story about a birthday party.
Oh, yeah.
where
That is
such a naughty thing to do.
Yep, you've got to get the book and have a read of that, which I won't give away your last chapter. You need to read the book because I reread the book, of course, to prepare for our chat, and full sobs again, and it still brings tears to my eyes, that experience for you. And I know for me there's been small things happen along the way where I go, that it can't be a coincidence, that has to be my son making his presence known.
Yeah.
Was that a really important part of your healing as well? Like, to end on that chapter, do you reckon that was like almost the most important thing for your journey?
I believe it was the greatest gift that I was given.
So it's a spiritual, without giving it away because you have to read it, just a moment where you feel your sister's presence.
Yeah, and that she's okay.
Yep.
And
she's come to give you a message, essentially.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I've heard, again, after publishing this book, hundreds and hundreds of messages from people, as you said, Bianca, who have shared with me messages when they think that butterfly that landed on their arm at this particular moment was a sign of a loved one connecting with them. So I've heard a lot more of this experience, but when it happened to me, I just couldn't explain it. I didn't have the understanding or the words to explain it. I just had to write down what it was and what happened. But it gave me such a sense of comfort that I feel so privileged for, because I know for whatever reason that happened to me and that experience didn't happen to other members of my family. If it had, they couldn't recognise that as such. So I feel very fortunate that I interpreted it that way, because it just made me happy. It just made me, it's all okay. And so that not knowing, which is another terrible part of so many deaths, but particular suicides, it was just answered without a real answer. And for someone who is very analytical and looking for evidence for things, it was an experience that none of that past training or that intellectual background could prepare me for, in a way, because there is no answer. And for there not to be an answer is no answer, you know. But in the way that it was delivered and how I interpreted it, it was absolutely an answer.
Yes.
You know.
And I think, not to get a woo-woo, but because I've not been a spiritual person at all until experiencing the death of our son, and I've become a bit more porous to the world around me. But us talking about nature, we have to believe that there are much bigger powers than what we believe we humans have. And I think that's such I'm a sciencey mind. I did a psych degree. I look for the evidence. I'm very analytical. There are just some things when you actually start to look that can't be explained. And if you interpret it in the way that it means something to you, I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, because in the end, I think what that whole experience of writing this book was to try to improve or deepen my understanding of what had happened. I could never answer why it happened. I think that that's also where you can tie yourself up into a lot of knots, because with so many deaths, the why is really not going to be answered. And if you're looking for the answer to why, your grief will just be endless and it will just never heal properly. So the why is something that I was so lucky I understood to just put that aside and just explore everything else. And the main thing that I came away with is that how can I use this experience to deepen my understanding, to help other people obviously cope with their loss and grief, but also deepen their joys that their loved ones, no matter how long they had with them, still can live on in really meaningful ways in your life. And what nature shows you, for me, it's a continuation of energy. And the energy of those people, I really believe, flows into the nature around us, the world around us. We are breathing it in, we are touching it. It's all around us. And so it's just a change of energy. There's liquid and gas and solids, and everything just moves between those states. And humans are no different from any other part of nature. We're exactly the same as those plants, as those birds, as those ants. And it's quite beautiful when you think of it that way. When you talk about porous, our skin is so porous. Things are going in and out of it all the time. Like, it made me love being a human a lot more as well, because, again, we can get stuck into that humans are the bane of the world and they cause all this terrible loss and destruction around the world. And I was of a general feeling that to save the planet, if humans had to end to save the planet, well, so be it. At least the planet would survive. I sort of used to think that was a fine option. But after going through this, I really fell in love with being human and how important to nature humans actually are. So it was sort of started a love affair again with being human.
You're a very amazing person, Indira.
Thank you.
Last question. What would you say to yourself in the absolute depths of those first few weeks of learning that your sister had died? What would you say to yourself to get you through or to comfort you at that point?
Oh, it's a hard thing, because if I had to go through it again, not knowing what was going to happen, and then think about what to say to myself, I don't think I would be able to. In those first few weeks, I really couldn't find any comfort, because it's so intense and so shocking that nothing is penetrating you. So if I was standing there watching me going through this, I really don't know what I could say, because it's something you just have to go through. It's really awful, but it's just something you have to go through.
Almost that anything that you would say to yourself back then would be trite.
It wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work.
Yep.
I mean, I'm thinking of all the phrases I would say if I
Yep.
was watching myself. It's not really that bad, or you're going to be okay, or it wouldn't be convincing to who I was. Obviously, me now, if I went through another loss again, the other thing I realise is that you would still have to go through it as if it was for the first time. And this is also very painful, because you think, but I went through that, and haven't I learnt a lot, and isn't that going to help me the next time? And unfortunately, every pain is its own pain. And just because I went through a terrible loss like that, if something, God forbid, happened similarly to another member of my family, it would still be traumatic and horrific, and I would still feel it all again. It wouldn't make it necessarily easier, but what would be the thing I'd have that I wouldn't have had is I know I'm going to survive this. I know I'm going to be fine at the end of the process. And I would have a very strong confidence about that, which I didn't at the beginning of this story.
Yes.
But it would still be really, really hard. Yeah. But I think knowing that you're going to be okay in the end, I think that's the really important message that everyone needs to hear, because you think, how will I ever get through this? Will this break me completely? And it'll be hard, but you will get through it. And in most cases, you'll be better at the end too. And it's just, I think, good and reassuring to hear that from other people who've been through very big griefs.
Definitely. When I read your book, I thought, well, you're still here. You wrote a book. So
I know.
that doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And that gave me hope
Yeah.
to go, okay, you did survive. You are surviving it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing as well, is that it's never healed. It's healing. It's surviving.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Well, I'm glad it helped.
Yeah, very much so. Indira, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Bianca, it's been a delight. It's been beautiful, and particularly beautiful to be in Launceston and telling this story and be looking out onto this beautiful view of the Tamar River and remembering all the beautiful stories growing up in this area. So, yeah, it's just been a very deeply beautiful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joining me to unpack the last interview is Dr. Mai Frandsen. She is a psychologist, health behaviour change consultant and researcher based in Tasmania. She earned her PhD in psychology in 2012 and is internationally recognised for her work in promoting health behaviour change using incentives. Dr. Frandsen is the owner of Trig Psychology, a private practice located in Tasmania, where she focuses on health behaviour change, working with first responders, adolescents and adults navigating significant life transitions. Her approach is characterised by authenticity and pragmatism, drawing from her varied life experiences. She uses a range of psychological treatment paradigms to get the best outcome for her clients. In addition to her private practice, Dr. Frandsen serves as a psychologist in schools and is an associate researcher at the University of Tasmania. Her research primarily focuses on smoking cessation, particularly among pregnant women, and has led Tasmania-wide clinical trials exploring the efficacy of novel, incentive-based interventions. Having stepped away from active research, Mai's passion project is science communication and can often be heard on ABC Radio sharing mental health hacks. Originally from Denmark, she has called Tasmania home since 1994. Beyond her professional pursuits, she enjoys engaging in outdoor adventures, endurance sports, and travelling both locally and abroad with her sons. Welcome, Mai. Hello, Mai.
Hello, Bianca.
Thank you so much for joining me today to chat about Indira's incredible story, interview, and book. I wanted to start perhaps with her unique experience of journaling and almost forced journaling to write this book, and your thoughts around that and how you would perhaps weave in that as a recommendation to some people to process, I guess, anything in their life.
It was obviously such a pleasure just to hear Indira speak of her experience and to share how she was almost forced to process the grief that was thrust into her life. And I don't think it was a conscious thing for her to, at the time of going, oh, I should write a book, that'd be great healing. I think it's something that she sort of intuitively knew that she should do or wanted to do. And exactly as she sort of speaks about, and in terms of working with my own clients, the not hiding from the painful feelings, to seek the answers that we need to in instances where we have been such uncertainty envelops us. We want to look for answers. Humans hate uncertainty, and This is why through the grief experience, a lot of it is why and what and how come this happened. And we're constantly trying to answer these questions, and the same in trauma, like we're trying to piece the pieces together. And so you've spoken of journaling before, and I guess the art of writing a book, and how she speaks about that being a grief itself, because you can't leave, you're in it. And so as Indira expresses in that, she's actually forced to sit with all those emotions and to obviously dip in and out of her own personal experience in the grief, but also she says she kind of takes it, she's able to take a third point of view, if you like, to step out of that and to understand from almost like a scientific point of view, or from an outsider's point of view, of what she's experiencing and why that might be, and also what others experience and what they've done. Although I would definitely not suggest for everyone that they write a book, because, she has incredible skills and all that. But journaling obviously is a micro version of that. And the reason journaling or talk therapy can be so impactful and so effective for people is because actually the act of expressing or putting words to how you're feeling or to the sensations inside you actually activates a different part of your brain. So this is why doing therapy on yourself doesn't work. I've tried. Because internally, like the thoughts and sensations, until you actually put words to that, whether that's expressing them verbally, through song, through whatever it is, or writing it, it activates a different part of your brain, and you are forced to actually articulate. And it's almost like a scientific process, because I guess depending on what language you have, sometimes different languages are much better at expressing different emotions. You and I, or with our audiences, obviously have an English language as part of their repertoire, and sometimes English is really useless at providing us with appropriate words. And then even that act of going, well, how do I even express this, is really therapeutic, because you get to kind of test, am I feeling sad? And I mean, I think things like sad and angry are kind of little umbrella terms for, and again, it comes down to language, right, and how useful it is actually expressing it, but it's a start. And often in therapy, the best moments I have with clients is when I offer a suggested word on how they're feeling, and they actually can say, no, it's not that. I'm not feeling angry. I'm feeling disappointed. And that's when you get to the meaty stuff. And so by journaling or writing, by talking to someone, you're actually problem solving, you're actually articulating and starting to flesh out and give voice to and have a sense of understanding of what's actually going on for you on the inside. And that's so important.
Is it, in terms of trying to process it, I've always tried to explain this to people in a way that makes sense. And I feel like maybe I've come up with an analogy. When you're trying to process something, it's like a stream. And if you don't process it, if you don't name it up, it's kind of like there's a block in the stream, and then that will overflow. Water will go places you don't want it to go. But if you do process it, and as we've spoken before, Bessel van der Kolk says, you've got to name it to tame it. And so if you can't put a word to it, if you can't express it or process it, it just gets stuck and blocked. So like with grief or any sort of challenge in life, mental illness, poor mental health, is it sort of being able to process it, lets it flow. It's almost like trying to get that flow state, and that journaling, talk therapy helps with that processing.
Your mind goes to a stream while you're talking. My mind goes to a really poorly built house. I can just imagining a bunch of not at all skilled builders, maybe they're accountants, I don't know, no offense to accountants, trying to build a house and not putting the right foundations in, but like you're on a deadline, you've got to build something, let's just whack something up. And similarly to your metaphor of a stream, I think if we don't have the right words, if we don't spend the time to immerse ourselves, as painful as it is, and we'll talk about pendulating in and out of and how that's an effective strategy, but unless we spend the time to understand how we're feeling and to immerse ourselves in that and have the time to build the foundations of what the experience has been and continues to evolve and be, If we don't do that, or if we just assume we're sad, we need to go over it, or we're angry and let's get whatever it is, revenge, it misbuilds that house, and then you get a really, really rickety crap house, right? That'll fall over. So if you don't spend the time building or processing it properly, it'll come tumbling down at some stage, and that's certainly what I see. And we've talked in the past about treatment approaches like EMDR and things like that, and how they can be extremely, extremely beneficial done in the right way, because it allows people to go back to those foundational, and the whole therapy itself is built on that, because the assumption is we've got core experiences that then shape experiences after that. And if when we're working through people's difficulties, we go to the biggest or the hardest memory, right? And it's really interesting once you unpack that, and it's usually a childhood one. Once you unpack that, it alleviates the pain or the challenge experienced in the other one. So it's kind of like going back to basics and rebuilding the foundations of the house, and then everything sort of falls into place. So I can't remember what the question was.
No, but that's a really great analogy. I really like that, to assist in understanding how great EMDR is, because I think it often comes up in a few of our conversations, the effectiveness that it has been for people. What would be your recommendation for someone who's trying to support someone, or someone listening to this, that is so uncomfortable with that grief, and they know they need to sit with it, but it's just too painful? It is like a hot plate on the stove that they're absolutely not going to touch and avoid at all costs, but they've got to do the work. What would you recommend in taking that first step to sit with it? Because, well, Indira is an example. She just seems to naturally have had incredible coping skills and dove headfirst and had a mindset, and I guess those foundations of that house were quite sound when what happened to her. And she's very fortunate to have been in that place, but not everyone is. What would be your recommendation? Because I see that often. I hear that in conversations of people not knowing how to encourage someone to start sitting with those really painful feelings.
Yep. Turn all your hot plates on and chop, put your hands on. No, absolutely not. But that's sometimes what people say and think, right? And we come from a place of good intent, of course, and we come fully packed with our own experiences. And, of course, in wanting to help others, we want to impart our knowledge, but our knowledge is contextual. And so, no, absolutely, we don't want to turn all the hot plates on and force people's hands on that, although it's really interesting. I think that's the approach that some of my older family members might go like, oh, just face it or just get on with it, whatever. And sometimes that information or that advice isn't helpful. So with everything, it's doing stuff in steps that's comfortable but uncomfortably comfortable. So it's the same with any type of exposure, right? And I think you can quite easily tell whether it's a friend or someone sitting in front of me in therapy when there is a block, there's a resistance, right, to sit with that emotion. And obviously it's super uncomfortable. No one wants to do that. Humans don't like discomfort. But if it's getting in the way of them moving through the grief or processing that, if it's meaning that they're stuck, then obviously they might need a little bit of help. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's okay to be stuck for a bit because it's a protective mechanism. It's like they don't have the resources to become unstuck at the moment to deal with that. But when someone's been stuck for a long time and it's impacting on their life, they're not leaving the house, they're not making meaningful relationships, you can see it in their demeanour that they've been stuck for a while. And in friendships, for example, if you give someone their space for a bit, but then you can see that their quality of life is deteriorating, and maybe that's because of not processing stuff or coming to terms with the grief that's happened. And so definitely get professional help if they're stuck like that, if they want, and they might not want to. One of the best things that you can do for a friend is to help create space for them to sit with that. And certainly if it's a client for me, one of the first things that I ask them to do is to engage in an activity where they feel safe enough to invite stillness. And so I'm thinking of clients who 5, 6, 7 years on, they're still stuck. And what they've done, they've created these incredible mechanisms of ensuring that they're really busy all the time, so they don't have to be still, because stillness and having nothing to do means that those feelings and emotions pop in, and that's super uncomfortable.
So interesting. I feel like I've done the opposite. I threw myself into feeling the feels and feeling the grief. And in recent years, because now I am in the years timeline of it all, I feel like I do that now. I have made myself too busy, quote unquote, too busy now to sit with that stillness. And I feel like for me now it's a hot plate that I can't go there.
Interesting. So my advice.
Yes.
This is not advice. This is general. It's a really nice term that I really like, is as a pendulum in and out of those emotions. And the same as we do for any sort of avoidance behaviour or phobia or whatever it is to dip in and out. And that's kind of what EMDR does to an extent, and other good therapy. So the first part of that is to create a space for yourself in the day where there is a stillness, and it's might be a time point, it might be a walk. Or I have a client who does not sit still. She's fantastic. She's in her 70s. And one of her bits of homework, which she was initially super uncomfortable with, was I asked her to sit still, make a cup of tea and just go and sit in the sun somewhere and be still and see what came up for her. I wasn't asking her to do anything hard, but it was to just be still, to kind of scan and feel, to try and name what it was that she was feeling and just then acknowledge it. It wasn't to fix it. It wasn't to judge it. It was just to sit and feel, to try and name that feeling and just acknowledge it was there, and that was it. And that would be the starting point, I think, for anyone. And that can look like different things. It can look like going for a walk. It can look like sitting still. It depends the sort of person. If someone who's really active, and I would ask that to happen as part of an active activity. So walking or running or swimming is a great place as well. But if at all possible, almost trying to be still, because that's really, really uncomfortable for people. That'd be a starting point, and then progressing that up. It's so interesting now we watch in society, and one of the reasons I think there is so much more anxiety and depression is we are so uncomfortable with stillness. And I don't know if the right word is boredom. I don't think it's boredom, but I think we're uncomfortable in there being a silence in our head that could be filled with other stuff. And like just driving to work, I have to have music on or the radio on, and then here I am judging the kids waiting for the school bus on their phones because they're doing something, and here I am in the car going, oh, well, I'm not comfortable with silence in the car. And so more and more, because we have this device or devices available to us to alleviate short-term boredom or short-term stillness, we automatically go to that. And I think because we're not good at stillness, we're not good at feeling the stuff that does come up when we aren't distracted by other things, we've become less, I don't know if you want to use the word resilient, or we've become less able to cope with those emotions that pop up. And I think that's a real issue.
We've really got to practice that, don't we? We've really got to strengthen that pathway and do that when we're not in a griefy moment. And would you say that, I think in Indira's case, that was possibly already her shield, because she could do the stillness because she would just do some gardening.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was thinking that when you were talking about how lucky Indira was to already have those skills, and she talks about a childhood of running around, riding a bike through Launceston and things like that, and how important gardening already was. So I think that's absolutely the case, that she already had those skills of being very comfortable in stillness and being aware of herself. But we don't always have that grounding, if you like. We don't always have that base as a house, depending on the way we were, where we grew up, who our parents were, all that sort of stuff.
It's almost in my intro, I say nothing can prepare you for grief. I always wonder, what are some of the tools you can have in your toolbox to deal with what life throws at you? And I think that's a really great one, is stillness, and to be able to sit with that discomfort is through stillness.
Yep. And it makes me think also, I remember someone, when I had my own kids, telling me, must have been some old, very wise person, said, make sure you get them a pet, because when they die, they need to learn what that feels like. And I just wonder about that too. We've removed ourselves from, and Indira talks about this, but more and more we're removing ourselves from nature and the natural ebbs and flows of life, right? And I think gardening, pets, all that sort of stuff plays a really important role, but also that stillness and being bored, the importance for adults, but for children to be bored so that they can come up with new thoughts or just get used to being comfortable, being uncomfortable. But because of adults and parents' own timelines and discomfort in there not being structural or things not being nice and controllable, because we shove so much in our timeline that we don't have any tolerance for kids' side gigs or journeys or stomping in puddles, right? Because we have packed our timeline so tight, we don't feel like we have capacity for anything that might come up. And I think that's a real issue.
Mm. You touched a moment ago on permanence, but also the cycle of life and understanding that not everything is permanent. But I did find it really fascinating, the whole concept of biophilia and nature, and what Indira found really helpful to her thinking and her processing was around her tree and that permanence of the tree, that when she goes, the tree will still be there as long as it's somewhat well cared for. Can you just talk a little bit more about how important having a concept of permanence is?
Mm. She also talks about how when something tragic happens, there's this sense of time stops. And I think one of the big things that happens is this fear of, can I survive this? Because it feels like this is it, you're in it. And I think that sense of being part of a timeline that continues, you can't stop time. Having that, and we've talked about chunking, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, the coping strategies that we don't even know we have, that we enlist when something massive happens that overwhelms our capacity to cope, right? But what I loved about what Indira was talking about is looking to nature as evidence that it's going to be okay, and that actually, while we have no control in this moment, that's actually a good thing, because take every day, every minute, every little chunk of time as it comes, and it will go on. And so I think that biophilia, or the looking at nature, and I think I've spoken in other parts, like for me, and I talk to clients about making sure you look up and out, and even just eyes on the horizon or eyes to the sky, the stars, gives us that sense of perspective and, again, that sort of sense of timeline in, even though this feels absolutely monumental and outside of our abilities to control, something's got us. Like, we're going to be carried along anyway, and we just have to cope in this moment, and then time will take us along and take us out of this moment. And so I think the other really important thing about that sense of permanence or looking to nature is when something unfathomable happens, or something happens that we have no measure of, and that's usually why it floors us, because we don't have any pre-existing schema of this. And we talked before about the importance of maybe having pets and stuff like that for children, because then they have a sense of schema, right? But we're always going to, well, hopefully not, but most of us will come across something that we have absolutely no schema for. And the importance of connecting with other people who've been through that allows us to mirror. And we have mirror neurons, and we can talk about that a lot of time. But the basic concept being, when you look at someone else or you speak to someone else that you know has been through that experience, you're getting a set of rules, if you like, or you're getting an example of how to feel and how to cope, and a reassurance when you see them that they've continued. And then on the other side, and I know you've spoken about how important figures like that who'd been on your similar journey was, to be able to say to you, you're going to be okay. And so nature is that, right? Nature is a form of saying, I've seen this before, mate, you're going to be okay. I've been here for 175 years, or however old that tree was that Indira really connected with. But on the flip side of that, and that's the weird thing about grief and trauma, because the timeline is just such a warped thing, and I mean, it's a weird thing as it is, but just as comforting, I think, is that sense of, whether it's permanence or not permanence, is that we're only here for a short time. And I think that helps put into perspective that whatever we're dealing with, as huge as it is for us, it's just a blip in the greater sense of this spinning thing that we're on that will just keep spinning regardless. And I think that can also be helpful, how insignificant we also are.
And it's not about diminishing one's experience, and it's not about saying someone has it worse than you, although Indira and I do talk about that as being helpful to both of our journeys. But I have personally found that helpful to look out and up and go, yep, this is just one story of millions of others similar, but finding other examples and, yes, seeing other people's way of coping, good, bad and otherwise, all of it is helpful, and it does create that sense of security and safety that it will be okay. And that's, I guess, as we as humans, we're seeking safety constantly, even if we don't realise that that's what we're seeking. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeking safety, that we're going to be okay. And I think it's society has made it feel like we shouldn't get some sense of, I'm sure there's a beautiful German word for this somewhere, but to get a sense of security in other people's suffering, right? Because, again, it normalises our experience. And we know that definitely an effective treatment for depression is to go and volunteer and go and make sure that you're giving to others, because it makes us feel good. But also it's a part of that is that sense of, again, perspective and normalising that suffering is a human experience, and that your suffering, while you can't compare it to someone else's suffering, is that people survive it. And then to hear other people's story that you feel is like worse than yours, again, that sense of reassurance that, well, if they can survive that, then I can survive this. And again, it's being able to have safety, as you say, but being able to look for examples and have schema. We're constantly doing that. We do that with our parents. We do that with our friends. We become teens. We're looking to others for guidance on how to behave. And that's why it's so important, if we can get to a point after a trauma while we're grieving, to reach out to others so that we can get that sense of perspective, because, again, you can't therapy yourself as much as you try. And so if you, of course, there's benefit in being still, being by yourself, doing that sort of self-reflection, but it can't be the only thing you do. You cannot, massive call here, I'm going to make it that you can't heal yourself by yourself. We're a social creature. Yeah.
I would absolutely agree with that. Even though I think I set out to think that I could heal myself, that was impossible. And as we've spoken, what has been the most helpful for me was other people and connecting with other people and sharing stories, which is such a gift as to what Indira has done, considering the taboo nature of suicide still is. I mean, we're recording this in the week of Suicide Prevention week, and the stats aren't really improving. The stigma is still very much there, and the more we talk about it, hopefully we will save some lives. In terms of Indira's role in society and her job and the obligation she had to show up, and I'm sure she could have just said, I can't come into work, but she didn't. She continued. Do you think that can be positive to someone's healing or sometimes a hindrance?
That's a great question, and it's very unique and specific to every individual. It's something you have to work with each individual with. There are so many benefits in when things happen and we close in, and that's a natural adaptive function. If something has hurt us or something is hurting us, then we turn inwards on ourselves to protect ourselves. And the reason we close down from society and from the people, even the people that we care most about, is because we are so afraid of more pain coming and us not being able to cope with that. We're barely coping as it is, right? But our beautiful amygdala that is part of that process of protecting us does sometimes overcompensate. Again, there's an adaptive reason for that. So when people come to me and they've been a bit stuck, or time has passed, or you can start seeing that their way of coping isn't actually helping them regain the quality of life, or things are kind of falling a little bit apart in there, whether it's family, work, interpersonal, whatever, being able to motivate them to change by having to rely on other people or being obligated to other people is a really, really effective strategy. So we know for any behaviour change, This is why people who pay for gym memberships are more likely to go, because it's like, well, I've paid this much money. Or things like boot camps or whatever, they pair you up with someone and you know that you can easily let yourself down. That's not a problem at 5 o'clock on a Monday morning, but we don't like letting other people down. And so the fact that Indira had a job to go to, and that, again, part of her kind of knew that that would be an effective thing for her to do, to continue to show up. And we've talked about that in the passage of time, to turn up and to go through her day and I guess be engaged in something that allowed her to have a break from those thoughts, that grieving, the process that takes part, right? And so that was effective for her. Amongst all the other bits and pieces that she was doing, she would probably say that was effective for her. I guess it's the same for clients I've worked with, the fact that they've had a job or had to parent, or dogs are great. I think we've talked about this. I'm really biased towards dogs. I'm sure cats are great too. If you've got one, go for it. But the dog still needs to be walked. You still need to go and pick up its poo on the lawn or whatever. So it just brings you back to like, this is the here and the now. There are still people that are relying on you. And so if I'm working with people who are stuck or who I think we can progress a bit, it's using their commitment to others, obligation to others, to kind of start to generate behaviour change. And very soon, it doesn't take long. So very soon that external motivation, that external sort of obligation to move will become internalised very quickly. We know people who have never exercised, they don't want to exercise. If they have an external motivator to exercise, they'll do that a little bit, and then in the internal mechanisms of actually this feels good will take over really quickly. And so I think in Indira's case that worked and was great and was a good strategy. But where I've also seen it go really not great is if there's this pushing down and denial and not having the stillness, not having the capacity to sit with that stuff, and then continuing to throw yourself into whatever that might be, and usually it's work, right? And it comes back to that stream or that house. Like, you can continue to build your life around that work, but if you haven't dealt with that knot, that bubble, that pain, everything that you do going forward, there's still something underneath that will come out and it will bite you on the ass. And you can tell with someone, because if you bring up the subject of the grief or the trauma, you'll see the blocking, you'll see the avoidance, and so you can kind of see that. But I definitely think the right amount of routine and continuing to give to others, even if that's a pet, is so important in feeling like you're still giving and that you're progressing and you're moving along this timeline that will continue anyway. Because I think sometimes one of the challenging things for people who've been through something monumental that other people probably can't relate to, especially, is that sense of how dare the rest of the world go on? Can they not see? Are they not aware of what's just happened? And if you keep fighting that, if you're not moving along with other people, then that resentment becomes bigger.
I distinctly remember walking out of the hospital out into the real world and going, how is everyone else just going about their day? This taxi driver that's taking us back to our accommodation, how does he not realise, you can go very insular and very me.
Mm.
And then it was not long after that I opened my eyes and thought, well, if I can walk around like this, how many other people are walking around with a lot?
Mm. And it's so interesting in what you just said then, you talk about the very inward-facing thinking or perspective, which is absolutely natural and normal for us when we're in pain. We need to hunker down, if you like. And then for you to shift through and then be able to have that perspective of, imagine how other people are feeling, and having that appreciation and I guess that empathy for others that comes from having especially an experience like you have. But I'm sure there was a bit of time that passed between having those two different viewpoints, but that's a natural, normal thing to do. And I guess where you would want to go and see someone professionally is if you're stuck in that, internalising, hunkered downness. And I guess what we're saying is the sooner you can get on board, even a little bit of the normal everyday routine train, just having a stream of that, just having a little bit of that in your day allows you to stay in touch and to continue building your life beyond. Yeah.
I was thinking about your house analogy and talking about how you can use your obligations as a positive tool to start to heal and to reframe how you can move forward, and thinking it's kind of, you've got to keep tidying and maintaining the house, but at the same time, a little renovation somewhere, because you've got to do that extra work. And I think I've witnessed, possibly sometimes in my own journey, but certainly in others that have experienced grief, and they have used that obligation of life as a mechanism, but almost to their detriment, because they haven't done any of the other work on the side. And it's like trying to carry both together, isn't it?
Yep. And it's a balance. And for some people, they can't do that yet. And actually just being able to carry on doing the things that they were doing, that's a great start, but can make you stuck. So it is an absolute individual experience. And I think one of the beautiful things about creating a sense of stillness as a part of coping through this, introducing that moment of stillness in your everyday allows you to check in with yourself, because what you need today is going to be different to tomorrow. And what you need today after a couple of years now, since Herb, like what you need today is different to then.
Definitely.
And so constantly, and that's for everyone, regardless of what we've all been through, it's that self-maintenance, giving yourself the time. I mean, we spend more time maintaining our cars and our coffee machines and dishwashers. We get very pissed off if the dishwasher doesn't clean the dishes properly. So we're like, all right, we need to put the rinse aid or whatever else in it. We spend more time on that than we do ourselves, and that's sad.
Or when we remember to clean the filter and go, oh, wow, look how clean the dishes are after I clean the filter.
Yeah. So take home, spend more time on your self-maintenance than you do in your dishwasher.
Yeah, good. And I think that's a great point to finish with, Mai. So thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is dedicated to my son Herbert and to all the fellow grievers out there. I'm sorry that you're here. Be kind to others, but mostly to yourself. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to mention that whilst I do have a degree in behavioural science and have spent years educating myself and researching the topics of trauma and mental health, I'm not a licensed therapist, counsellor or psychologist. Everything I share here is based on personal experience and things I've learnt through education. This podcast is for informational or entertainment purposes only and isn't the substitute for professional advice. If you're struggling, please reach out to a GP or a qualified therapist. You're not alone, and there is help available.